I have been the Duke of Morthwaite's solicitor and closest friend for 31 years, and in all that time I have seen him unmoved by fire, flood, the threat of ruin, and the death of men he admired. I have watched him sit across a negotiating table from men who wished him destroyed and offer them nothing, not a flinch, not a word more than was necessary, not the faintest signal that their hostility had reached him at all. I have seen him carry his mother's coffin on a gray January morning, and speak at her graveside in a voice so steady you would have thought he was reading the terms of a lease, rather than saying goodbye to the woman who bore him. I have watched him receive word of failed harvests, costly litigation, and the loss of a man he counted a friend, and absorb every one of them with the same contained, deliberate stillness that the county called coldness, and that I had long since understood was nothing of the kind. The county was not entirely wrong. He was cold the way a deep lake is cold, solid and still at the surface, apparently simple, and entirely beyond ordinary sounding. But cold is not the whole of a deep lake. There are things at the bottom that the surface does not reveal, and 31 years of close acquaintance with a man will show you what is at the bottom whether or not he means to show it. He had never meant to show it to me, precisely. It had simply become visible over time, the way things do when you are patient and quiet enough to wait. I was a young man when I first knew him. We were at the same university, at an age when young men assemble themselves into the shapes they will spend the rest of their lives maintaining, and he had assembled himself very early into a shape that admitted almost nothing. His father was a hard man and a demanding one, and the sons of hard, demanding men tend to become either replicas of their fathers or their opposite, men so guarded, so private, so thoroughly in the habit of concealing what they feel that the world calls them cold when they are in fact simply defended. Crispin Aldenvane, 4th Duke of Morthwaite, had become the second kind. I had understood this about him for 30 years without his having confirmed it once. He did not confirm things, he let them be true, and you reached your own conclusions. I tell you all of this so that what I am about to describe will have its proper weight. Because when Elspeth Vane stepped out of the hired carriage on the morning of the 23rd of November and walked across the frost-stiffened gravel of Morthwaite's front court, I was standing 2 paces behind the Duke, as I had been 100 times in 30 years, at the entrance to 100 houses, for 100 arrivals of varying consequence, and I watched the defended private. Carefully controlled man I have known for 31 years go absolutely still, in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with composure. He had heard her name announced, that was all it took. Her name, spoken by the footman who had met the carriage at the gate, passed through the house to the entrance hall where we were standing, and the Duke had heard it, and the stillness that came over him was not his ordinary stillness at all. His ordinary stillness is willed, the stillness of a man who has decided to be still, who is in full command of his own surface. This was something else. This was the stillness of a man who has been handed back something he believed irrevocably lost, and cannot yet determine whether to hold it or whether it will dissolve the moment he closes his hand. I had watched him receive word of his mother's death with less disruption than this. She was 41 years old. She had been plain at 27, or so people said, and they had said it, though not in my presence more than once, because I have a face that communicates a particular thing when it hears nonsense, and most people learn to attend to it. She had not been plain. She had been the sort of woman you notice only after you have been in a room with her for an hour, and then you wonder how you failed to notice her at once. Quiet, precise, with a composure that had clearly been built and tested rather than simply inherited, and with a quality of intelligence that showed itself not in display, but in the accuracy of her listening, the quality of her questions, and the unfailing competence with which she handled whatever was placed before her. These are, in my experience, rarer qualities than the kind of beauty that catches the eye at a distance, and then disappoints on closer examination. I had thought so from the beginning. The drawing-rooms of Aldenmere County had not agreed with me, but the drawing-rooms of Aldenmere County have been wrong about most things that matter, and I have learned not to expect otherwise. She had come to Morthwaite when she was 18, not yet a lady's maid, not a housekeeper, simply a girl from a village 20 miles to the east, the oldest daughter of a country clergyman who had died without adequate provision, with a reference from the village doctor and a quality of self-possession that I was told was remarkable for a girl of that age. She worked her way through the household over 3 years. The Duke's aunt, a sharp-eyed woman of 70 who required a lady's maid with actual sense rather than the decorative variety, had taken her on in her 3rd year. The aunt was very particular about her people, and she kept Elspeth until she died, at which point the household needed a housekeeper, and the transition was, by all accounts, entirely natural and required almost no formal arrangement. 9 years in this house, all told. And then one September morning, 14 years ago, she was gone. No scene. No formal resignation of any kind. She had packed what was hers, arranged for her trunk to be sent to a forwarding address in the town of Calverton 40 miles to the west, and left on a Tuesday morning without ceremony. The Duke said nothing to me about it. I had been at Morthwaite that week on other business, and I had noticed her absence the way you notice a change in the arrangement of a room. Not instantly, not with a clear identification of what has altered, but with the persistent, uneasy sense that something has been rearranged, and the new arrangement is not quite right. The staff reported that she had taken a post in the West. The household continued. The East Wing, where the aunt had lived, and where Elspeth had managed much of the upper-floor domestic life for 6 years, continued to function. But it functioned the way a very well-made clock functions after you have removed one of the smaller weights, correctly, technically, and with something absent that you could not locate in the mechanism, but that you felt in the room whenever the clock struck. I did not ask him directly. I considered doing so several times over the months that followed, and each time concluded that the question would produce either a dismissal or a silence, and that neither would tell me more than I had already inferred. So I kept my inferences to myself, and Morthwaite went on as Morthwaite goes on, slowly, expensively, and with the particular air of a very large house that is occupied but not fully inhabited. Now she crossed the frost toward us, 14 years later. She was different from the woman who had left, not greatly, because the core of her had always been settled, and that quality had only deepened. But different in the way, a person is different after a decade and more of living their own life rather than someone else's. She carried herself with a completeness that had not been fully present at 27. Her widowhood sat on her not as grief. She had had 4 years to make her peace with it, but as a kind of earned solidity, the bearing of a woman who has come through something and arranged herself carefully on the other side. She had dressed with care. The traveling coat was dark gray, sensibly cut, brushed until it was as good as brushing could make it. Her hair was arranged with more precision than a day's journey strictly required. She had prepared for this arrival with the same thoroughness she had always brought to anything she undertook, and the thoroughness had never been careless about what the thing meant. She came to the foot of the steps. She looked up at him. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Vane," he said from the top of them. And that was how 14 years ended, with their titles. I have set this account down in the order things happened because the order matters. A thing like this does not arrive all at once. It comes the way a thaw comes in a country frozen a long time, invisible underground, and then suddenly everywhere. And if you were watching casually, you might think it sudden, but it was not. It had been building under the surface for as long as the freezing had held. I was watching closely. It is the habit of my profession and the habit of 31 years of friendship with a man who requires careful attention to understand it all. He showed her to the library himself. He did not delegate this to me, though I was present and it was the obvious arrangement. He said, "You'll want to be out of the cold," and he walked her through the entrance hall and down the long north passage, and I followed at a professional distance with the estate papers, feeling rather more like a piece of the furniture than I usually do and finding this, under the circumstances, entirely acceptable. The library at Morthwaite is a long, north-facing room that I have always found more genuine than the grander rooms elsewhere in the house, lined from floor to cornice with leather-bound volumes in dark oak shelves that go back 3 generations, smelling of beeswax and old paper and the deep particular cold of stone in November regardless of how many fires are lit. There was a fire, high and warm, casting good light into the corners. I had not ordered this fire. The household staff had therefore been instructed by someone with the authority to give such instructions, and those instructions had been given some time before her arrival, because the room was fully warm when we entered it, which requires preparation of more than an hour. I noted this and filed it with care. She sat across the writing table from him. I took the solicitor's position to one side, spread the estate papers between them, and we proceeded with the business of the morning. She had read everything I had sent her over 2 years of correspondence, and she had annotated her copies with penciled questions in the margins. A careful, prepared mind brought to a carefully prepared legal question, and she asked them in order, without flourish, in the manner of someone who has done the necessary work and intends to dispatch the thing efficiently. He answered her with precision and without condescension, which is more than most men of his station manage when dealing with a woman on a matter of business. And I watched her notice this, watched something in her expression find a slightly easier arrangement, not relief precisely, but a settling, the release of a posture she had been holding since the carriage gate. They were, I noted, remarkably similar in this way, in the precision of their questions, in the direct quality of their attention, in the underlying seriousness they brought to whatever was before them. They had always been similar in these ways. I had observed it over 9 years of her being in this house, and in the years since, when I thought about her from time to time, and attempted to make sense of what I had watched without being able to adequately understand it. Two precise, private, composed people who had managed to spend 9 years in the same house without telling each other anything true. The papers were signed before 11 o'clock, less than an hour for 2 years of deferred correspondence. Then neither of them moved. I organized the papers into their folder. I returned the inkwell lid to its position. I rearranged the blotter in a way that required no rearranging. I was buying them time they had not asked me for and did not know what to do with. And I was buying it because 31 years of knowing a man had left me with opinions about what he needed that he himself was not always equipped to identify. The fire settled. The wind came around the west corner of the house and whispered at the library windows. The gray November light fell through the glass in its honest, unreserved way, the kind of light that conceals nothing and flatters nobody and is nonetheless, for those reasons, oddly comforting. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "you have come a long way, you'll stay to luncheon." This was not phrased as a suggestion. She began to decline. He interrupted with the information that her carriage had been rearranged to the following morning. She considered this for a brief moment, the moment of a woman weighing refusal against acceptance and concluding that acceptance costs her less, at least in the immediate calculation, and said, "Thank you." I excused myself with the estate papers and went to my study at the end of the hall, where I have kept a working desk for 20 years, and I did not close the door with complete thoroughness behind me. I am not going to claim otherwise. I had been waiting for something I could not have named with precision for 14 years, and I was not yet ready to be entirely out of range of it. I could hear them from the library, low voices, intermittent, the particular quality of a conversation between two people who have known each other very well and then not at all for a long time, testing the space between them to discover what it will now hold. The tone was careful on both sides, exploratory in the way of careful people discovering that a thing they had thought closed might in fact be open, and proceeding with the alertness of someone who does not wish to misread the sign. I sat at my desk, and I thought about what I knew, which was more than I had ever said aloud to anyone and considerably less than I had been made to feel it was adequate. I knew she had loved him. She had not told me so. She was not a woman who told people such things, not about matters of that weight. But 9 years is a long time to observe someone moving through a house, and I had been observing her since her first year at Morthwaite, and I had reached my conclusions some time before she left. I had watched her manage his household with a precision and care that went considerably beyond the professional duty for which she was paid. I had watched her notice things about him that other people, his family, his staff of many years, the guests who came and went, did not notice. When he had not slept, which showed in the set of his jaw and the pace at which he moved through the house in the mornings. When he was carrying something heavier than the ordinary weight of his position, which showed in a deepening of his silence, a quality of distance in him that an inattentive person would have called his usual manner, and that she would have identified, correctly, as something more specific. When the coldness that the county feared and his family accepted was not coldness at all, but the particular kind of grief that forms when a person has been required to be responsible before they have been permitted to be young. And that calcifies over the years into an exterior so controlled that the person inside it can barely be perceived from without. She understood him. I have thought over the 31 years of knowing this man that this is a rarer quality than love, though it almost always arrives with love or produces it, which amounts to the same thing. I had known, equally, that he felt something for her that was not the ordinary regard of a man for an excellent employee. I had seen it in small, specific ways over years, and small, specific things over time become a pattern, and patterns tell a story if you are willing to read them. The way he deferred to her judgment on household matters considerably beyond what her formal authority required. The way he listened to her when she spoke, with a fullness of attention he did not bring to most conversations. The particular quality of the house during her years here, not merely running correctly, because it had run correctly before her, and would run correctly after, but having a quality of ease, of being actually inhabited rather than merely maintained, that I would not otherwise have thought to apply to a large country estate managed by a man of the Duke's disposition. He had loved her in the way that private people love, silently, without declaration, without any action that would have made it possible for anyone to hold it against him or require him to maintain it publicly, for 9 years. And she had loved him in the way that sensible women love men who cannot say what they feel, by staying, until staying was no longer possible, and then by leaving cleanly, without accusation, without any scene that might give either of them cause for bitterness. She had written to him after leaving. The first few letters had passed through the estate postal arrangements, and I had seen their arrival noted in the household records. He had read them. I had encountered him once with one, the first winter after she left, in the corridor outside his study, the paper folded small in his hand, his face doing the careful nothing that it does when it is working at maximum effort to conceal the something underneath. He had pocketed the letter and asked me about the Northfield drainage situation, and that had been the entirety of it. I had assumed, as months became a year and then 2 years and then more, that the letters had ceased. That she had done what sensible women do when a thing is fully over, moved forward, closed the door, attended to the life that was available to her. It was the kindest interpretation. I held it for 14 years. I was entirely wrong about it. We had luncheon in the small dining room, the 3 of us at his arrangement, and we talked about the county, the changes in the roads and the market town, the way the old estates had reorganized themselves as the last decade reshaped what was possible for the families that held them. She asked good questions of the specific variety that show genuine prior thought about a topic, and he answered with the quality of attention he gives to things he considers worth thinking about, and I watched him watch her as she talked about the years in the West, the town where her husband had practiced, the landscape, the work, the ways it was different from Aldenmuir's hills and what she had come to find in it. With the focused quality of a man trying to account for every month of the time she had spent elsewhere, the years he had not been present for, fitting them now into some internal reckoning. She noticed him watching. She was not unsettled by it. She met his eyes once directly, and returned to her food with the composure of a woman who has made a prior decision about how to conduct this particular day, and is holding to it regardless of what the day produces. I had always admired that quality in her, the composure not as absence of feeling, but as the management of it, the decision to be steady when steadiness was required. After luncheon, he asked if she would walk with him. The south garden, he said, was reasonable in the cold, and the box hedges were in better condition than the season would suggest. She looked at him with an expression that was, in careful equal measure, amused and wary, and she said she would. I remained behind. There are limits to what a man can witness directly in the course of a single day, and I had either reached mine or decided to behave as though I had, which amounts to the same thing in practice. I went to my study and sat with documents I was not reading, and at one point I went to the window. They were on the gravel path between the box hedges of the south garden, she in the gray coat, he in his dark one, walking in the slow, purposeful way of 2 people who are not walking toward anything in particular, but who have found that forward motion makes certain conversations easier than standing still. The air between them was not the air of strangers. It had a quality of intentional proximity, of 2 people who have chosen this distance and this pace. That was its own kind of statement about what the afternoon had become. He was talking. He was talking at some length, which is not his usual manner. He speaks precisely and answers questions and ventures observations, but sustained talking is not his register. And yet here he was, sustaining it, and she was listening with the full quality of her attention. And then she said something in return, and I watched him stop walking and then begin again, and his shoulders had something in them that was not their ordinary set. Something was not as held as it had been. She was attentive. She had always been attentive with him. That was the other side of the quality I described earlier, the specific knowledge of him. She knew what his attention was when he gave it, and therefore what it meant when she had it. She was giving him her attention now with the same completeness, and I thought, watching from the window, that this was the shape of what had existed between them for 9 years. Two people paying each other the kind of careful, full attention that is its own form of declaration, without either of them saying a word about it. They came back inside with cold in their coats and color in their faces. She said she ought to gather her things before the light failed. He told her the carriage had been arranged for the following morning. She stopped. She turned and looked at him with complete clarity. "You told them tomorrow morning," she said, not a question. A statement that acknowledged what had been done and invited him to confirm it. "Yes," he said. A silence in which several things were acknowledged without being named. "I see," she said. She was shown upstairs to the blue room on the first floor, the east-facing room with the morning light, the room she had occupied through most of her years at Morthwaite. The fire had been laid and lit, fresh water in the basin, the curtains drawn back to let in the last of the afternoon. Someone had attended to all of this, and the attending had been done before she arrived, which required instructions given in anticipation, and those instructions had been given by someone who knew which room she had always used. She came down to dinner in a blue wool dress with small jet buttons, chosen from her traveling bag with more foresight than the occasion nominally required. She had packed it. She had packed a dinner dress for what was supposed to have been a single day's visit to sign papers and then leave. I found this notable. He had found one of the better burgundies from the cellar. The dining room fire was high. And Morthwaite Hall, which I had watched function excellently and feel rather empty for 14 years, felt, for the first time I could precisely recall, like a house that was genuinely occupied in the full sense of the word. Not maintained, not administered, inhabited. She was quieter at dinner than at luncheon. The afternoon in the garden had done something, permitted something held at careful distance to come close enough to be real, or allowed something to be said that changed the quality of the silence afterward. He was no longer disguising the fact that he was watching her. She was aware of this with the entire quality of her attention even when she was not looking at him, which is the quality of someone who has spent years in the same rooms with a person and learned to know where they are without needing to look. I have attended a great many dinners in 31 years of professional life. I have sat at the edges of significant occasions, engagement dinners, farewell dinners, the formal meals that precede settlements and conclusions of various kinds, and I have observed what people say and how they say it and what the silences between the sayings contain. I have never attended a dinner quite like that one. Afterward, I excused myself on the pretext of a letter to review, genuine, as I said, though I did not read it until the following morning. I left them in the drawing room with the fire and the last of the burgundy, and I went to my study, and I sat there not working, and I was not surprised when I heard her footstep in the corridor approximately 40 minutes later. Quick, purposeful, unhurried and unhesitating, the step of a woman who has made a decision and is moving to implement it. She went to the library. I heard the door. I gave it 10 minutes, approximately the time required for a determined woman to locate what she is looking for in a room she once organized herself. Then I went. She was at the far corner writing table, in the poorest light of the room, holding a small iron key in one hand. Before her on the table, its lid open, was the rosewood box. She had known where to look, of course she had. 9 years teaches you every habit of a man's study. The keys kept in the left drawer, the things he needs close kept in a box on the table at which he works every evening. She had come looking for her letters. She had expected perhaps 3, perhaps 5. She had found something else entirely. She was holding one of his letters. His handwriting, the close, controlled, angular hand I have read for 30 years on contracts and estate correspondence and the occasional personal letter. And her face had the expression of someone who has reached down expecting to find solid ground and discovered that the floor is not where they believed it to be. She looked up and saw me in the doorway. "Hartley," she said. Her voice was doing extraordinary work. "Mrs. Vane," I said. A pause. "Were you aware," she said, choosing each word at its exact weight, "that he wrote to me?" "No," I said, and I had not been, not of the letters, not of their number, not of what they contained. "He wrote to me," she said it aloud to establish it as a fact, to fix it in reality rather than in the realm of what might be wished or imagined. "After I left, this letter is dated 14 years ago, December." A pause. "He says he was wrong to say nothing. He says he had been wrong in this matter for a long time, and he did not know how to say it and did not have the right to say it anymore. I did not speak. The vocabulary available to me did not cover the situation. She reached into the box and drew out another letter, then another, all in his hand. All addressed to her at the forwarding address in Calverton. She read the dates from the upper right corners, her lips moving very slightly, and I watched her face as the pattern of the dates became clear to her. Not a cluster from shortly after she left, but a sequence that extended through the years, year after year, letters that had been written and kept without being sent. "He never sent any of them," she said. "No," I said. "Why?" The word came without the shape of a question, because the shape of a question implies uncertainty about the answer, and she was not uncertain. She already knew the shape of the answer. She was saying the word to keep the knowing from overwhelming her too quickly. I said nothing. This was not mine to answer. She heard my silence for what it was. She set the letters she was holding very carefully on the table, the careful way of someone whose hands are not entirely steady. She looked at the door. He was standing in it. I do not know how long he had been there. He moves without sound on stone, always has, a quality that has unsettled generations of Morthwaite staff before they learned to account for it. He was standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged into the blankness that the county read as coldness, and that she was reading through now with the fluency of long and specific acquaintance, undiminished by 14 years of distance. She read his face the way she had always read it, not as a skill exactly, more as a kind of knowledge that had become instinct. And what she found there was, I could see, something the county would not have found at all. "You kept them," she said. "Yes," he said. "All of them?" "Yes." "You wrote back?" "Yes." "How many?" 37, he said. She absorbed this, the number, what it implied about the 14 years, what it meant that a man had written 37 letters to a woman and kept every one of them in a box on his own writing table. She reached back into the box and counted what was there, counted the letters in his hand, counted her own, her lips moving, and she stood with the count. "How many of mine?" she said. 19, he said. "You wrote 19. She turned back to her letters in the box and counted them again, and I watched her face as the number became clear, and the number was not 3, and it was not 5, and it was more than she had believed she had written. 19 letters sent to a man she had believed was not reading them, kept in a box with 37 unsent replies, spanning 14 years of living separately. "I thought you had stopped receiving them," she said, speaking carefully, holding the composure by an act of will. "After the first few I thought you had returned them or had them returned. I kept writing because I wanted you to know that I had not left in anger, that I was not bitter about it, that I wished." She stopped. She could not finish that sentence in front of me, with him in the doorway with the 14 years still between them. "I wrote until I thought there was no longer any purpose. The last one was written from my husband's house the year after we married. I wrote it and did not send it because by then I had made my arrangements, and the arrangements required that the door be closed. But I wrote it." "I received every letter you sent," he said. "I have read each of them many times." Her face, I am not going to attempt an adequate description of her face in that moment. Some things exceed the vocabulary available to a solicitor on a November evening in a library, and this is one of them. "And wrote 37 in return," she said. "Yes." "In 14 years." "Yes." "And never sent any of them." "No." She stood with the weight of all of it, the 56 letters in total, hers and his together in the same rosewood box, a correspondence that had existed in full and been conducted in perfect silence, with neither party knowing that the other was doing the same thing from their side of the distance. "Why," she said, "why did you not send them?" "Because you had left," he said, "and I had not stopped you, and I did not think I had the right to ask anything of you after that." He said it directly, without hedge, in the voice of a man who has been holding a sentence for a very long time and has finally released it into the air. "I could not say it. I have never been able to say these kinds of things, in speaking. I can only write them, and I did not send what I wrote because sending it seemed to impose on someone who had gone for good reason, and whose decision I had forfeited my right to reverse." He looked at her steadily. "And every year that passed made the sending seem less rather than more possible, which is not a reasonable way to think about it, but it was how I thought about it, and I am trying to be accurate." "You had 9 years," she said. "Before I left, you had 9 years in which to say something." I know. I would have stayed. I know you would have. She looked at him. The look was extraordinarily concentrated. The full weight of 9 years of shared space and 14 years of distance. The full weight of 19 letters and 37 replies, and under all of it the original thing that had made the letters necessary in the first place, the thing neither of them had been able to say. I came here today, she said, to sign those papers and then find my letters and burn them. That was the whole of my plan. I was going to conclude the business and destroy the evidence and go home and be entirely finished with it. I had prepared myself very carefully for that. She looked at the box, then at him. I was not expecting to find this. No, he said, I know you are not. A pause. Will you read them? He said, the letters. They are yours, everything in them was always for you, even when I could not send them. I would like you to know what is in them. I would like you to know what I should have told you in any of the 9 years we were in the same house, and what I should have told you in any of the 14 years since. He looked at her. I would like you to know that I have not been comfortable. She said, yes, I will read them. He crossed the room and took the bundle of letters, all 37, held with a piece of cotton ribbon frayed with handling, and he put them in her hands. Their hands were briefly in contact over the letters. Neither of them remarked on it. She carried the 37 letters to the chair nearest the fire, and I added coal that was badly needed, and she sat down and she began to read. He sat across from her in the other chair. He said nothing. She said nothing. The house went entirely quiet around them, the deep quiet of a large stone house in late November when the staff have gone to their rest, and the wind off the Aldenmere hills is the only sound that reaches inside. And I sat near the coal scuttle and tended the fire and stayed, because I was not going to be elsewhere, and there was no longer any pretense required about why. She read for a long time. He watched her read, and he did not try to conceal the watching. He sat with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes on her face as she moved through the 37 letters, one by one, with the careful and complete attention she brought to anything that mattered to her. His face had in it something I have seen there very rarely, something undefended, with the quality of a man who has put everything he has into a single action and is waiting entirely still to learn what it amounts to. She was not easy to read while she read. She had never been easy to read. She had always been contained, and the years had made her more so, not less. But the firelight does something to faces that ordinary light does not, and I had known her expression for a long time, and I saw things cross her face as she worked through the letters that were not the composure. Something that might have been grief, at intervals, not for herself, I thought, but for the time, for the 14 years of letters existing in a box. Something that might have been in another sort of person, anger, not at him, I was fairly certain, but at the shape of the thing, at the way too careful, contained. Private people had managed to spend 14 years living separately when they did not have to. And something else. Something that sat between grief and anger, and was neither. Something that I reached for a word for, and settled at last on recognition. The recognition of a person who has been trying to understand the shape of something for a very long time, and has now been given enough light to see it clearly. She read each letter thoroughly. Several times she slowed at a page and read a particular passage again, her eyes tracking back to the top of the paragraph. Once she was entirely still for a long moment with a letter in her hands, not reading, her gaze somewhere in the middle distance where memories live, and then she came back to herself and turned the page. She reached the last letter. The reed stack in her left hand was thick. The single remaining page was in her right. She read it through. She read it again, more slowly. She set it in her lap and looked at the fire. The last one, she said, is dated 6 weeks ago. Yes, he said. Before I agreed to come. Before I knew whether you would agree to come, yes. She looked at him. What does it say, the last one? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that I intended to show you the box if you came, that I had reached the end of the 14 years and could not continue them in the same fashion, that I would rather know and be refused than not know and watch you go away again as I had allowed before. A pause. That the asking would at least be honest, which the last 14 years had not been, not in any way that counted. She said, you arranged for me to come. He said nothing. The land matter could have been settled at a distance. Hartley offered to settle it at a distance. He said nothing. You deferred it for 2 years. Yes, he said finally. She looked at him for a long time, the precise, thorough look of a woman who sees clearly and is determined to see clearly now. Then she said, "We have been very considerable fools, both of us, for a very long time." Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to a smile I have seen there in 31 years. "I think that is accurate," he said. "You should have sent them," she said. "Yes. Even the first one." "Yes. I would have come back years ago." "Yes," he said, "I know." She looked at the 37 letters in her lap. She looked at the fire. She said, "I am not finished, Crispin." "As it turns out." He crossed to her. He took her hand, the hand resting on the arm of the chair, the hand not holding the letters, with the deliberate care of a man who has been a long time without something and intends now to hold it properly. She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that I had not seen in all the years I had known her. Not the composure, not the management, not the careful control. The thing the composure had always been protecting. The thing underneath it that had been there for 19 years and had been waiting, very patiently, for it to be safe enough to show itself. He said, "I did not know how to say it. I only knew how to write it, and I did not send what I wrote, and both of those failures are mine and not yours, and you had every reason to leave and none that I gave you to stay." "I know that," she said. "I know that it was not. I never thought it was your character that was insufficient. I thought it was your feeling." She looked at him. "I thought you did not feel enough to say something. I understand now that it was the reverse." "Yes," he said. She said, "You should have told me. In any of the 9 years, you should have found the way." "Yes," he said, "I should have." She turned her hand in his, adjusting the hold to something more purposeful. "Will you write to me?" she said. "Going forward, letters that actually arrive." "Yes," he said. "And call on me." "Yes." "And not defer for 2 years." The shadow of that smile again. "No," he said, "not for 2 years." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "Then I think we have been sufficient fools for sufficient years, and I would like to be something other than foolish for whatever time is remaining." "Yes," he said, "so would I." I left them then, properly this time, out of the room, up the stairs to my own rooms at the east end of the corridor, door properly closed. I sat in my chair and did not trouble myself with any pretense of work. I had been waiting for something I could not have named precisely for 31 years or 14 of them at least, and I had seen it. That was enough. I did not need to witness the rest. The house told me what followed, in the ways that houses tell you things. The extra place at breakfast the following morning, laid without instruction by a kitchen that had formed its own conclusions. The sound of 2 voices in the drawing room after supper on the second evening, filling the space in the unhurried manner of people who have nowhere pressing to be and nothing more important to say than what they are saying to each other. Her carriage rearranged again on the second morning, again on the third. She stayed 4 days in the end, and when she left she carried the 37 letters under her arm and left her 19 in the box, and the rosewood box on the writing table was open and unlocked. On the 4th morning the Duke came to my study and sat down in the chair across my desk. He sat, which he rarely does. He is constitutionally a standing man. He looked at the fireplace for a moment before he spoke. "I intend to call on her," he said. "In the new year in the West, I intend to call on her and to ask her properly and clearly and without any ambiguity about what I am asking." "Yes," I said, "I think that is right." He looked at me. "How long have you known?" "Which part of it?" He considered this for a moment. "Any of it." "Long enough," I said. He accepted this with his characteristic dignity. He stood and straightened his coat and looked out the window at the front court, where her carriage was being brought around, and where she was just then coming out of the front door in her gray coat, the 37 letters tucked under her arm. Her chin was at the same angle it had been when she arrived, the angle of a woman bracing herself. But what the angle carried now was different. She was not bracing against difficulty. She was bracing in the way of a woman carrying something valuable, who intends to carry it with care. "Hartley," he said. "Your Grace. Thank you for the papers, for the management of the visit." He was still looking out the window, a pause. "And for the coal," he said, "in the library." I looked at him. He was not looking at me, but the corner of his mouth had in it something for which his face had no formal vocabulary. "The room needed it," I said. He went out to hand her into the carriage. Formal, proper, full observance of courtesy. and then held her hand a moment past what formality required, looking up from the gravel while she stood on the carriage step. They said something I could not hear from the window. She smiled, a small, private smile, the smile of a woman in possession of 37 letters and 4 days, and the clear knowledge of what is coming toward her. He called on her in January, alone, without staff or announcement. He stayed a week and came back and said nothing about it to me except a brief mention that the West Road was in better condition than he had expected for the time of year, which I understood to be a considerable amount of information in very small packaging. He went again in February, March, April. In April, he wrote from the West with a brief instruction to prepare the appropriate paperwork for an occasion anticipated shortly. I prepared it with full professional care and the minimum possible visible satisfaction, which I consider a genuine personal accomplishment given the circumstances. The county talked, the county always talks. The cold Duke of Morthwaite, they said, had formed an attachment to a nobody, a widow, a woman without family or fortune or position who had been a servant in his own house. They found it peculiar and slightly embarrassing, and several of them said so, and a few said so to his face, which required a boldness I found remarkable. He received their opinions with the full authority of a man who has faced better objections from men who meant him genuine ruin, and returned nothing, because the opinion of the room had ceased to be a factor in anything he was calculating. She became the Duchess of Morthwaite in June, in the chapel on the estate grounds, with the necessary witnesses and no ceremony beyond what was true and meaningful to the two people at the center of it. I stood at his side. She came to him in old ivory, her hair arranged with the precision that had always characterized her approach to things that mattered, and she walked to him without hesitation, and neither of them was trembling. And when he took her hand, I saw in his face the same thing I had seen in the library in November, that arriving quality, the look of a man who has covered a very great and very circuitous distance, and has finally understood that he is exactly where he was always trying to get to. I shook his hand afterward, and he gripped mine in the way that carries everything he does not say. I shook hers, the new Duchess of Morthwaite, the woman who had come to burn letters and found instead that the letters were already answered, and she looked at me with her clear, precise, warm eyes and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hartley, for all of it." "I added coal to the fire," I said. She smiled the smile I had seen on the carriage step in November. "Yes," she said, "you did." The rosewood box is on the writing table in the library, unlocked. The key hangs where it has always hung in the left drawer, but there is nothing in the box that needs locking now. It holds 56 letters, 37 in his hand, 19 in hers folded together, and it is not a secret. It is a record. A history of two careful and private people who managed their feelings with such thorough and counterproductive efficiency that they spent 14 years living separately when they might have lived otherwise, and who managed at last to be honest with each other, which was the only thing that had ever been required. The library at Morthwaite is a warmer room now. There is always a fire laid and lit, not only in anticipation of arrivals. There are 2 chairs at the hearth. In the evenings, if you pass the door, you will hear 2 voices in the room, his, low and deliberate, and hers, precise and warm, talking in the way of people who have found that they have a great deal to say to each other, and have been given at last time enough to say it. I have been a solicitor for 31 years. I know when a matter is properly concluded and the parties are genuinely in agreement. This matter concluded in November in a library with a high fire and an open box and 2 people who had finally stopped keeping things from each other. Or perhaps it concluded 14 years before, when a woman left a house that became quieter without her, and a man sat down at his writing table and wrote the first of 37 letters he would not send. Or perhaps it did not conclude at all. Perhaps it simply changed, from the kind of love that lives in a locked box to the kind that fills a lit room, in fires always laid, in 2 chairs at a hearth, in voices that fill the spaces where the silence used to be. Which is, by any accounting I know how to make, the far better kind. Let me tell you more precisely what those 9 years looked like, because the shape of them matters. She had been organized in her work from her first days, as housekeepers at a house like Morthwaite must be, a house that size with that staff, with the Duke's habit of having things as he wanted them without specifying what he wanted, required someone who could read the house, anticipate its needs, and manage its daily operations with a minimum of consultation. Most housekeepers require clear direction. She had required almost none. Within her first 6 months, she had the house running in ways it had not run under her predecessor, not because the predecessor had been inadequate, but because Elspeth Vane had a particular gift for understanding systems, for seeing how a thing was organized and where the gaps were, and filling them before they became problems. He had noticed this. I had watched him notice it in the first year in small ways. A comment at luncheon about a household matter that had been resolved before it required his attention, with the specific observation that it had been resolved well. A note in the household accounts, reviewed quarterly, that drew my attention to 3 items that had been regularized under the new housekeeper's management, with a marginal annotation in his hand that said, simply, better. He was not a man who annotated household accounts with personal observations. He was not a man who noticed the domestic organization of his own house unless something was wrong with it, and things were not wrong with it. They were, in fact, as close to right as I had ever seen a house of that size and that particular difficulty. She had also noticed him. I observed this over time in the way she spoke about household matters when consultation was occasionally required, which was seldom, but not never, and in the way she managed the particular complications that arose from his habits. He was not an easy man to work for. He was precise about what he required and entirely incapable of specifying it in advance, which meant that the household had to learn to anticipate him, and anticipating him required a specific kind of attention to a very private person. She had paid that attention. She had learned him, not intrusively, not presumptuously, but with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understands that knowing the person you work for is part of the work, and who brings the same care to that knowledge as to everything else she does. There had been, in the years before she left, a handful of evenings, the kind that arise naturally in a large house when the schedule of guests and formal occasions has cleared, and the house belongs for a few days to its inhabitants, when she and the Duke had been in the library at the same time on separate business, and the separate business had become, without much fanfare, shared company. He read in the evenings. She often had accounts to review, or correspondence to attend to, or occasionally a book of her own, and the library was the natural room for both purposes. These were not arranged evenings. They arose from the shape of the house, and the habits of 2 people who were both in the habit of working in the evenings, and who found, without any formal acknowledgement of the fact, that they did not mind doing so in the same room. I knew about these evenings because the Duke had mentioned them to me once, very briefly, in the context of a comment about something else entirely, one of those sideways disclosures that private people sometimes make when they are speaking of something other than the thing they are actually speaking of. He had said, in passing, referring to a question about whether some piece of household correspondence had been dealt with, "I believe Mrs. Vane dealt with that." We discussed it last week. She was reviewing the quarterly accounts on Thursday, and I was able to clarify the situation. The phrasing of it, the natural, unremarked quality of the she was reviewing the accounts, and we discussed it, told me something. It told me that this was not unusual. That it was the kind of thing that happened without requiring explanation, because it had happened enough times to have stopped being an occasion, and become simply what Tuesday evenings or Thursday evenings or evenings in general sometimes were. I did not say anything about this at the time. I filed it and continued. Those evenings were, I think, the heart of what existed between them in the 9 years she was at Morthwaite, not the grand, dramatic moments that stories prefer to record. Not a declaration made at a ball or a confession extracted by crisis. The slow, ordinary accumulation of shared evenings in a library, of a man who could not speak his feelings learning the face of a woman who understood him without requiring speech, of a woman who loved a man she could not speak to about loving him, finding that the not speaking was, in the evenings, less painful than she might have expected. That is what 9 years of a wordless thing looks like, if you're watching it. It looks like Thursday evenings in a library. It looks like 2 people in the same room, reading and accounting and occasionally speaking about something else entirely, until one of them leaves. There is something I should record about the walk in the South Garden, which I have described from a distance, but which I understand better now, having had occasion since then to hear something of what passed in it. He had spoken about the house. She told me much later about the period after she left, and what it had been like, in the careful, indirect language he uses for things he cannot say plainly. He had said that the house had run correctly, that nothing had gone wrong with it in any practical sense, that the staff were well managed by her successor, and the accounts balanced and the routines continued. He had said all of this, she told me, with the air of a man listing facts that are completely accurate and entirely beside the point. He had then said, and this is the part she told me with the particular expression a person has when they are recounting something that broke something open in them, that he had come to understand, over the first year without her, that he had made a fundamental error, and the error was not in what he had done, but in what he had failed to do, which is to say he had failed to speak at a time when speaking was still possible, and that failure had been his and not circumstances and not timing. And he had known it clearly by the end of the first winter. He had written the first letter in December. She already knew. She had been holding it when I came into the library. And he had written it and read it over and understood that it said what needed to be said, and that sending it was the honest thing to do. And then he had not sent it, because sending it felt like asking something of her that she had not invited him to ask. And she had been gone for 3 months and had her own life in the West and whatever the letter contained. It was about his situation and not about hers. He had kept it. He had written the second one in February and kept it too, and so on for 14 years. She had listened to all of this on the walk without interrupting, which was like her, and when he was finished, she had been quiet for a long moment, the quiet of someone thinking rather than of someone at a loss for words. And then she had said that she thought she understood the reasoning, even if she thought the reasoning was wrong. He had said, yes, it was wrong. He had said, I knew it was wrong by the time I was writing the 5th or 6th letter, and I continued to write them and not send them because the alternative, writing nothing, was worse, even though sending them would have been better. He had said this with the particular quality of honest self-assessment that I have observed in him at his best, the capacity to look at his own failures with the same clear-eyed accuracy he brings to other people's problems, without excuse and without excessive self-condemnation. She had said, that is the most accurately foolish thing I have ever heard a man say. He had said, I know. She had said, you might have been free of this years ago. He had said, yes. She had said, we both might have been. And he had said, yes, and we were not. And here we are in November with frost on the box hedges and a land parcel question that required 2 years to bring you here. Here we are. She had laughed, she told me. Not the composed, managed laugh of a woman maintaining a public face, but an actual laugh, surprised out of her by the sheer absurdity of the accounting. 2 precise, competent, apparently sensible people who had managed to complicate something very simple into 14 years of indirect correspondence. It had struck her, suddenly, as genuinely funny, in the way that things are funny when the alternative is something too large to face directly. He had apparently smiled. An actual smile, she said, not the shadow of one I have occasionally observed from a distance, but an actual smile on his actual face, which she had not seen in 9 years, and which she had forgotten, or had thought she had forgotten. They had walked on after that. The garden is quite long. They had walked for another 20 minutes at least, before they came back inside. I record all of this not because I witnessed it, but because it was told to me, later, by the Duchess of Morthwaite, who told it in the manner of a woman revisiting something with the pleasure of someone who now has the luxury of finding it amusing rather than painful. She told it to me in the library, in one of the chairs by the fire, with the rosewood box on the writing table in the corner, and he was elsewhere in the house on some business or other, and she said, Mr. Hartley, I want you to know what we said, because you were kind enough to add coal to the fire, and I think you deserve to know what the fire was for. I thanked her. I did not say that I had rather suspected most of it. It seemed unnecessary. There is one more thing I want to record about the letter reading, because it is the thing I think of most when I think of that evening. There was a particular letter, I do not know which one, by number in the sequence of 37, that she read twice, very slowly, and then held for a long time without reading further, the way a person holds something when the reading of it has required them to stop and simply receive the weight of the thing they have just understood. I do not know what was in that letter. I have never asked, and I never intend to. Whatever he had written in the 37 letters was between the 2 of them and not mine to know. And I have been a solicitor long enough to understand the difference between information that is professionally relevant and information that is simply interesting, and to behave accordingly. But I know what was on her face while she held it, and I know what was on his face while he watched her hold it, and I can tell you that the combination of those 2 expressions, hers, something quietly struck open. The complete, undefended attention of a man who has put everything into a letter that is now being read after 14 years, was the most private thing I have ever witnessed in 31 years of professional life, and I witnessed it by the light of a fire in a library in November, and I will not forget it. I will not forget either the moment after she set it down, after she had read it through and held it and read it again and finally set it in her lap with the other letters, when she looked up at him and he was watching her, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment. The fire made a sound. The wind came around the corner. The candles held steady. Then she said, "The last one is dated 6 weeks ago." And he said, "Yes." And they proceeded from there. These are the things that actually happen when two people come to the end of 14 years of keeping things from each other and decide to stop. Not speeches, not grand gestures, a fire in a library, a box of letters. A man saying yes, and a woman saying I am not finished, and the particular quality of stillness that follows when something that has been held for a long time is finally, carefully put down. I added coal to the fire. I am glad I was there to add it. I am glad I was there for all of it. I want to say something about the 14 years themselves, because they were not nothing, and the shape of them matters to understand what that November morning meant. The Duke continued at Morthwaite as he had always continued, working, managing the estate, receiving the guests that position and business required, conducting himself in all public respects with the exactness of a man who takes his obligations seriously and discharges them thoroughly. He was not a recluse. He did not withdraw from the world. He went to London when London was necessary, attended the county occasions that his position made unavoidable, participated in the legal and agricultural and civic matters of Aldenmere with the scrupulous attention that his father had instilled in him, and that he had, by the time I knew him well, made genuinely his own rather than simply inherited. But the house was different, not visibly, not in any way that the staff could have identified or that the county would have noticed if the county had ever paid the kind of attention to Morthwaite that would have made the difference apparent. It was different in the way I described earlier, the way a room is different when one of the weights of its mechanism has been removed, still running, still keeping time, but with something absent in the quality of the running. The east wing was used less. The library, which had been the natural room for the evenings I described, felt different in the evenings. He was in it. He continued to use it in the evenings, with his books and his correspondence. But the particular quality of the library evenings had changed in a way I observed without quite being able to name. I came to Morthwaite regularly throughout the 14 years, as I have always done. The estate business requires quarterly visits at minimum, and there are periods when it requires considerably more frequent attendance. I had my desk in the study. I knew the house and the Duke as well as I knew anything. And what I observed over those 14 years, in the intervals between the professional visits, in the quality of his company when we dined together or reviewed accounts together or walked the estate as we have always done, was not a man who was suffering dramatically. He was not dramatic about anything. He was a man who had organized himself around an absence the way you organize a piece of furniture around a gap in a room that used to contain something, carefully, with precision, in a way that was entirely functional and entirely aware of the gap. He spoke of her once, in all of those 14 years, and indirectly even then. We were reviewing a domestic matter that had required a decision about some reorganization in the household, and I had offered a suggestion, and he had said, "I believe the previous arrangement was better." I had asked which previous arrangement he meant. There had been several, and he had said, "The one in Vane's time." The way he said it, her name without title, which he had never done in my hearing when she was in the house, was not careless. It was the opposite of careless. It was the way you say a thing that you have kept very private, and are not quite done keeping private, and have let slip for a moment, and immediately reassemble the privaciness, and proceed as though nothing has happened. I said, "Yes, I believe you are right," and we moved on. That was the only time. In 14 years. I had the rosewood box in mind when he said it, or rather, I had in mind the presence of something in this house that was being kept, without knowing yet what was being kept. It was only in November that I understood, but the 14 years were not empty for either of them, and I want that understood. She had her life in the West, and she had built it well. Her husband had been a decent man, as I said, and she had been a good wife to him, which I say not as a small thing but as the large thing it is, To do justice to a life that is not the one you would have chosen is a form of integrity that not everyone manages. She had managed it. She had made the house in Calverton run as efficiently as she had made Morthwaite run, which is to say very well indeed. She had involved herself in the affairs of the town in the useful, practical ways that a capable woman can involve herself in the affairs of a small market town when she has time and skill and a genuine interest in the people around her. She had not been unhappy. But she had written 19 letters, and the last one, written in the year after her marriage and not sent, had been, she told me this, too, later, the hardest thing she had ever written and the hardest thing she had ever not sent. She had written it because he was still there, inside her understanding of herself, in the way that things are there when they have organized a significant portion of your experience without ever resolving into the form they were trying to reach. She had written it and kept it and eventually destroyed it, the one letter of the 19 that was not in the rosewood box, because keeping it was its own form of not moving forward, and she had decided to move forward. She had moved forward. She had been a good wife and a competent woman, and she had built a reasonable life, and she had not been unhappy. And she had come to Morthwaite with a very clear plan to be finished, and she had found the box. The box is what I keep returning to. The fact of it. The fact that he had kept it on the writing table where he worked every evening, not in a cabinet, not in a safe, not in any location that suggested concealment from himself, only from others. The fact that the box was on the table where he could see it, and the key was in the left drawer where it had always been, and he had read the letters in it, hers and his, with sufficient frequency that the ribbon binding his own bundle had frayed significantly and had been retied once with the knot in a different position. 37 letters over 14 years, reading them over, retying the ribbon, keeping the box where he could reach it. This is what love looks like in a very private man who has decided he has no right to speak. This is what it looks like when you can only write it and cannot send what you write. It looks like a rosewood box on a writing table, and a key in a drawer and 37 letters in a fraying bundle, and the knowledge, always every evening in the same room, that they are there. I think she understood this when she opened the box. I think the understanding of it was what put the expression on her face that I saw when she was holding his first letter, not shock exactly, though there was something like shock in it, but recognition. The recognition of someone who has finally been given the evidence for something she has half believed for 14 years and not been able to trust. He kept the letters. He kept all of her letters. He wrote 37 answers. He kept the box where he could reach it. That is not a man who felt insufficient. That is not a man who was comfortable. She had believed for 14 years that the silence meant there was not enough. She had been wrong. The silence had meant there was too much, and he had not known what to do with too much, and so he had written it down and locked it in a box and lived for 14 years within 20 feet of the evidence of it. I added coal to the fire. She read the letters. She said, "I am not finished." These were the right things in the right order. And the rest, the calling in January and February and March, the appropriate paperwork prepared in April, the June morning in the chapel with the necessary witnesses and no unnecessary ceremony. The rest was simply the life that follows when two people stop keeping things from each other and begin, at last, to say what is true.